Los retos de esta clase son aprender cómo conjugar el verbo soler, poder utilizar el verbo soler en sus 6 formas y poder agregar un infinitivo para decir lo que alguien suele hacer. So the goals of this lesson are to learn how to conjugate the verb soler, to be able to use that verb in its 6 forms in the present tense, and then to be able to add an infinitive to this verb to say what someone usually does. First, we need to know our ER verb endings because soler is an ER verb. And it's an irregular ER verb, but it does use the normal endings. So those ER verb endings are o, es, hemos, es, en. Hopefully you've seen those before. If not, after this video, it might be worth checking out my video on how to use ER verbs in the present tense. So now we've talked about the ER verb endings, we can take a look at that verb soler. So soler in its infinitive form, in its neutral form, when it's not being conjugated into any person or any tense, we can kind of translate this as to usually do something. We don't really have this in English. What we do in English is we say the personal pronoun, like I or you, the subject pronoun, sorry, like I or you, and then we add the word usually, and then we add a verb. I usually go, he usually does, she usually eats. So we use this word usually. In Spanish you could say normalmente, we do have that, but Spanish also has this word, and people mix and match. Sometimes they'll say normalmente como pizza, and sometimes they'll say suelo comer pizza, I usually eat pizza. So it's a really useful verb to have in your vocabulary. So I've already given you an example using suelo, I usually, then we've got sueles, you singular, use it usually, suele, he or she or it usually, also the form that we'd use with usted, the formal you, solemos, we usually, soles, you all, you plural usually, and then finally suelen, which is they usually, or ustedes usually, the formal and plural form of you. Now I did say at the beginning that soler is an irregular verb, and you may have picked up on how that irregularity presents itself on the last slide when we looked at those 6 different forms. Now what happens, and you might have already started to think about this, or you might be familiar with these sorts of words, these sorts of verbs, is that instead of keeping that stem sol, so normally we take off the ER, and what we're left with, we just work with that 6 times. Notice it goes to swell. It goes to swell, swell, but then it goes back to sol, sol, and then back to swell. So these sorts of verbs, there's lots of them, we call them radical stem changing verbs. Some people call them boot verbs because they kind of follow, and you might have to use your imagination here, I've drawn a boot to try and help you, they kind of follow the shape of a boot. Or you can also call them L-shaped verbs, so boot verbs, L-shaped verbs. The proper name is radical stem changing verbs because the stem, the bit that's left when you remove the infinitive ending, that changes. Now soler is not alone in doing this. There are lots of verbs that follow this pattern, and it's always the same 4 conjugations that change in the stem, and it's always the same 2 conjugations that stay the same. So solemos, soles, that's actually perfectly regular. Okay, those conjugations, if you look at the infinitive, soler, you remove the ER and add hemos, you get solemos. Remove the ER and add es for vosotros, vosotras, you get soles. It's only in the I, the you singular, the he, she, it, or the singular they, usted, and the ustedes, or they form where these verbs change. Another example of a radical stem changing verb is poder, the verb to be able to do something. Puedo, puedes, puede, back to podemos, podes, and then back to the radical stem change. So this also follows the boot shape. What we need to do now is add an infinitive verb, so soler plus an infinitive verb, that gives us our complete sentence. Some examples. Suelo comer mucha fruta. I usually eat a lot of fruit. Mi abuela suele llamar los domingos. My grandma usually calls on Sundays. Solemos ver películas en vez de series. We usually watch films instead of series. So you now know how to form soler, you know to use it with an infinitive verb, but before you go I want you to try translating some sentences just to make sure this really makes sense, because sometimes we can understand it on a conceptual level, but until we actually try and use it in our own speaking or our own writing, we might not actually know how well this is really sunk in. So translate these sentences into Spanish. Number 1, tourists usually visit the castle in my town. 2, for my birthday, I usually eat pizza. 3, my friends and I usually play football. And number 4, which is a question, do you usually go to the park? Now for that one, remember that questions in Spanish are just statements with a question mark, and your voice goes up at the end of the question. So in English we say do or does, and then a verb, do you like, do you usually do this. In Spanish, just you usually go to the park and do you usually go to the park are exactly the same formation. It's just your voice, your intonation, and the question mark. So take a moment, pause the video, translate those, write them on some paper or in your Spanish book if you can, and then press play when you're ready to go through. Número 1. Los turistas suelen visitar el castillo en mi pueblo. 2. Para mi cumpleaños suelo comer pizza. 3. Mis amigos o mis amigas, mis amigues y yo solemos jugar al fútbol. Y número 4. ¿Sueles ir al parque? Just a quick reminder to hit that like button if you found this video useful, if you found it interesting. It's just a click of a button or a tap of the screen for you, but it really means a lot to me and it helps me to know which videos people have found most useful as well. Also, if you have any comments, please do use the comment function below. You can say something that you learned, something that you found a bit difficult, and again, it will help me to plan future videos. And if you haven't already done so, please do hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of the future videos that I'll be posting. If you really don't want to miss out on any of them, you can also turn on notifications.